Hello, everyone, and welcome to our November PolicyEngine UK training session. I'm Max Ghenis, co-founder and CEO of PolicyEngine. I'm here with my colleagues Nikhil Woodruff and Vahid Ahmadi, and we're excited to share with you some of our work uh, analyzing the autumn budget. We previewed some of the potential reforms last month, but we now have a full analysis of several of the provisions. And also we'll share some information if you're new to the PolicyEngine platform around how to use PolicyEngine to calculate individual household tax and benefit programs. And then really excited to preview for you some of our work developing slices by each parliamentary constituency. So with that, I will turn it over to Nikhil and Vahid.
Thanks, Max. So just for an overview of where we're planning to go with this session today. Firstly, for anyone who missed the first training session, we'll just do a brief recap of what are the core features of PolicyEngine, what is PolicyEngine, what can you do with it. We'll then talk a little bit about our analysis of the autumn budget. So probably the biggest fiscal event of this year and maybe in future years. We analysed changes to capital gains tax, employer national insurance, VAT and fuel duty. So we'll talk about the numbers that we got and how you can use the app to try them again with different assumptions or try different policies. Then we'll demo a feature that we didn't actually demonstrate last time. Last time we focused on using the tool to generate impact estimates for the macro level impacts of different policies. So how much does a program cost the government if we were to implement it? This time we'll show how you can use PolicyEngine to dive down to the sort of abstract household level. So for a given example household, it's often really useful to be able to know how a policy affects that household specifically, as opposed to the millions of households in the UK. Then we will also just round it off with a bit of a preview for what we'll shortly be releasing, which is constituency level impacts. So instead of being able to know how much a policy would benefit the average UK household, we'll be able to say how much a policy will benefit a specific, the distribution of households in a specific local constituency. So, for example, Guildford or cities of Westminster or Durham, one of those. And then we'll open up to any questions, but that's the sort of agenda for today. So going through these slides today, thanks Max, will be myself and Vahid, and we work in PolicyEngine UK developing these features. So I'll just go through the core features before we move on to the autumn budget. Okay, so just to recap, what PolicyEngine does is we write open source economic models that compute the impact of public policy. So the single biggest model that we write and contribute to and use is our micro-simulation model of the UK's tax and benefits. So we have a model that basically, for a given household and given policy rules, simulates a household's taxes, a household's benefits. So asking the question of how much in benefits am I entitled to, how much in taxes am I liable for? And when you do that over a representative data set of households, what you get is a really kind of granular level impact estimate of the budgetary impact, the distributional impact of different policies. So this policy model is essentially a implementation of the tax and benefit law of the United Kingdom. We have over 20 different tax benefit programs modeled, things like income tax to universal credit. We have tests that we use to check, is the logic that we've got actually right? You know, if we pass in this household, do we get the answers that we'd expect to get from a different benefits calculator? So we do lots of testing like that. And then we use modern technological tools. We use Python, we have sort of standardized JSON and YAML outputs. And it's because of this, I think we have quite a sort of modern, up-to-date framework that is easy to maintain and also hopefully easy for developers to use. You can see on the right-hand side, on the top right, we've got our GitHub activity. So there's a pretty vibrant ecosystem of developers contributing to these models. And on the bottom right, you can see a screenshot of our web app, which we showed last time. And this web application is basically the online interface for which anyone can go to and talk to our model directly without having to dig into the code. You can plug in a form, get out an impact estimate, and do with it what you'd like. Just a note on validation, as before. Transparency is a pretty big principle at PolicyEngine. We calibrate and check our model against hundreds of different statistics from other government agencies. So the best estimates of taxable income, or total populations by age group, or total spending by benefit type. We have all these external statistics that we trust, and we measure how well our model performs against them. And generally, we're pretty close. We also calibrate explicitly to some of these targets. We've got a public validation dashboard where anyone can go to this page on the internet and basically see, for a given kind of external statistic, what's PolicyEngine's answer? How different is it to the government's answer? We're using different data, of course, so it's not going to be an exact match, but we're within pretty close error thresholds for these statistics. And then finally, just to round it off, so PolicyEngine aims to be a kind of unified data layer for all of these conversations, whether you're a journalist writing a story about how a policy is impacting or would likely impact a population, or whether you're an analyst at a think tank who wants to score the impact of a policy reform on a particular sort of demographic group, or look at how it wants to affect poverty rates. There are parts of the PolicyEngine stack that answer to all of these, or whether, for example, you're a machine powering a benefit calculator website. PolicyEngine is designed to kind of interface with all of these different user groups under the same underlying tax benefit model. So with that, I think we can move on to the autumn budget, which is probably the most exciting thing that's happened this side of the year. So I will pass it on to Vahid to talk a little bit about this.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Nikhil. Yeah, as we know, the government announced for the autumn budget 2024. So in this slide, we want to first see what for sure we know that happened. For example, employer and IC rates rise, or other part of the reforms, and also there are some terms that we know they are likely to happen. For example, a large CGT rise or employer pension and IC rise. In the next slide, we want to emphasize that any result that we are showing to you is completely got from the app that we have. So for example, a user can go and adjust the parameter in the website, and for example, different part of the parameter here, they can adjust and change to create different type of reforms and see what happened from the aggregate level and also from the household side. As you can see, there are different type of parameter here that they can adjust, and also there are some features. For example, they can see the result and the impact on different years, and also they can run in a more compact data to see just the result on the less data on the calculation. And also we will show you how under each reform how we can see the impact on each household. The cool feature that we added for the PolicyEngine is we try to move from the completely static analysis to a kind of dynamic analysis by adding behavioral response modeling. For example, we can see that we have some publication on the media. So by adding behavioral response modeling, we are actually targeting a kind of more valid result to see the impacts of the different reforms and different policies in the aggregate economics and also on the micro level side. First reform that I want to talk is capital gain tax. This reform is about changing the rates, raising from 10% and 20% to 18% and 24%. And our projection estimates that the CGT reform will raise 6.4 billion pounds from 2025 to 2029. For this analysis, actually, we assume that individuals our kind of response to the policy changes and what happened in the economy. And yeah, based on the economic literature, we actually assume that the elasticity is this number that you can see. But I want to emphasize that this is just an assumption from our side, so you can just adjust different number for the elasticities from the labor side and also from the capital gain side. And again, you can run the web app and see the result. In this table, you can see the budgetary impact, the revenue for the government, our estimation, and also we compare to other sources like HM Treasury and OBR. So, for example, you can see that the total budgetary impact from 2024 to 2029, we estimated a bit lower than HM Treasury and OBR. This is likely because we assume different number for the elasticity of labor side and also for the capital gain side. And by the way, you can just adjust that and see what happened in the web app. Yeah, for each reforms and also for each changes that you can adjust in the web app, we actually presented some cool stuff to see what happened in the aggregate economy. One feature that we present here is distributional impact. For example, this figure says that under the CGT reform, only 1.2% of the population are affected. So, for example, you can see that in the top decile, there are some 5% of the people in the top decile in the UK will lose more than 5% in the income. And you can see that in the lower decile, there is no kind of impact on their income. Yeah, perfect. Another reform is employer national insurance. So the changes include rising the main rate from 13.8 to 15%. But there are some other terms in this reform. And we assume that the 40% of the incidence is borne by wages in 2025 and rising for each year 10% by the point. But you can modify this assumption and rerun the web app to see what happened. So yeah, in this slide, I want to explain the national insurance reform that we talked in the previous slide from the budgetary impact side. So first, we want to say that on the static analysis reform, on the static assumptions, we actually projected the budgetary impact, and you can see that the comparison to HM Treasury and OBR again here. For example, in each year, 2025 to 2026, we are a bit higher than HM Treasury and OBR, again, because of the assumptions, and also maybe we are using a kind of different data set. But again, you can see the total impact here and comparing to other sources. From the dynamic analysis side, as we discussed, we actually add behavioral response for the dynamic part. And again, here you can compare the PolicyEngine result to the OBR. Perfect. For this reform, actually, the distributional impact says that 66% of the people will see a kind of decrease in their net income. And again, you can actually see what happened for each decile. We are actually presenting some other cool stuff on the web app for the distributional impact on different decile and percentile, what happened to the poverty rate, what happened to the, for example, Gini index. Is there any effect on the inequality in the economy or not?
Nice. Just a thing I'd add on this. I think one of the kind of like interesting ways about doing things with PolicyEngine with this kind of score is that, for example, lots of external analyses on capital gains tax reform are done on like microdata of people with capital gains. But the nice thing about these distributional impact charts is they are literally, they are over the same people. We are looking at the same population of people between this chart and this chart. So we can like directly compare two different forms on the same distribution, rather than having to sort of use, data that's closer to the actual kind of admin side, but is less comparable to, what is the household population of the UK.
Cool. Yeah, the other thing that I want to add is that actually on the web app, the cool thing that we offer is that you can build reform on each other. So for example, you can see if the baseline reform is something, by adding the other elements and changing the other elements, what happened to the economy. So this is the cool feature that the user can play around with that to see what happened under different reforms and different regime in the economy. Okay, the other reform is that levying VAT on private school fees. So it is about rising private school VAT rate from 0% to 20%. The budgetary impact under this reform, you can see this table. For example, PolicyEngine, we are actually estimating that the total until 2029. The total budgetary impact is 7.7 billion pound. And you can see again here the comparison to HM Treasury and OBR. For the most of the estimation, we are actually within a kind of good error number to other estimation and other sources. And this slide, again, you can see the distributional impact to see what happened for different decile in the term of income distribution. Actually, we estimated that the policy would decrease the net income for only 3% of the population. And you can see that the most affected part of the population is the top decile. And yeah. I want to invite you to check our website for the other report that we published about the budgetary impact and also other impacts for the autumn budget. We actually work on the capital gain tax reform and the national insurance and VAT for the private school that we discussed, and also for the field duty reform. And also we did a cool analysis on the benefit operating for the next year, and other more cool things that you can check. Okay, I will pass to Nikhil.
Thanks, Vahid. Cool. So that was a lot of sort of macro level calculations, looking at the cost and the distributional impact. But I think to understand a lot of these policies, it is really helpful to go down to the individual household level, and even to not just understand how policy reform would change things, but how does the tax benefit system currently work in the household system right now? So one of the things we can do is use the web app to calculate household tax and benefits. So if you go straight into the websites and plug in a household's details, we'll be able to see, okay, how is your net income now? How would it change under a given policy reform? So with that, I am going to keep sharing my screen and walk through this. So I think, yes, everyone can see my screen. Okay, so the first thing I think that we do is we basically go to the Compute Policy Impact page in this top right button here. You can also jump straight into Compute My Tax and Benefits here. So just once again, PolicyEngine has two main entry points. You can jump into the sort of household first way of doing things, where you start with a household and then maybe thinking about policy reform, or you can start with the policy reform and then maybe think about a household. Let's start with the household, because that's what we care about most right now. So I'm going to click Calculate My Tax and Benefits. Right, so this has taken me to a page. It's got 3 panes on it. The left one says, tell us more about your household. So that's kind of, this is a summary pane. It will fill in with results as we start giving the PolicyEngine more information. On the middle here, we've got a bit of a navigation, kind of a table of contents kind of widget here that gives us some overview of what we're going to be looking at. And then on the right, we've got the main details pane, just like in the policy reform side, where we look at a particular policy parameter. So I'm going to click this big green button, enter my household. So let's look at 2025, because that's when most of the autumn budget will come into effect. So we're a 2025 household. Let's go marital status single. Let's go one child, Maidstone, local authority, Maidstone. Let's go our region with default representative regions, and employment income. I'm going to say 30,000 around median income, and my age, let's say I'm 40 and have a 10-year-old child. So what this does is it basically says, here's all the things I'm going to calculate, and then it calculates them. So in about 5 seconds, we've got a calculation for my disposable income in the 2025 fiscal year. So this breaks it down into household market income, so that's just non-governmental income, household benefits, and household taxes. And in each one of these, we can see how this is broken down. So if I want to know, okay, where does my market income come from? It comes from employment income. Where do my benefits come from? It comes from child benefit. Where do my taxes come from? It comes from income tax. I'd also just like to point out here, we've got a nice kind of widget here. For example, your child benefit respective amount is £1,354 per year. We also have an AI-based feature that basically uses some knowledge about how our model is coded to come up with an explanation for how we actually worked this out. So it looks at the source code of our model, and it basically comes back and generates a full kind of page-long explanation of what is the logic, what are the parameters involved in coming to this decision. So aiming for transparency here. For example, you've gotten this child benefit because your 10-year-old child qualifies as a child or qualifying young person. The eldest child status matters because if you're not the eldest child, you get a low amount of child's benefit. And also the fact that, this is a monthly benefit, but it remains stable throughout the year. So that's just kind of useful if you want to debug any particular kind of number that you see here that isn't sort of immediately understandable. So that's our calculation for this household under current law as it stands. But there's often things that you want to dive into in more detail. So for example, one of the most common things that people ask about households and tax and benefits is, how would things change if you earned more or less? So for example, let's say what would happen if we took this household and imagined 100 different possible versions of this household where they earn anywhere from £0 to £100,000. What would their disposable income be at each point? Can we kind of visualize this landscape of different earnings? So we can just click this button here, and it will go away and ask the PolicyEngine API this exact question. And this takes about 30 seconds most of the time. And when it comes back, it's going to have a kind of chart where it's going to basically lay out the answer to that question. And here it comes. So, for example, what we've got here is a line chart that shows if your household earns £0, what's their disposable income? If your household earns £200,000, what's your disposable income? And we can see how this line shape changes. And it's interpretable as well. If this line is steeper, then that means that there is kind of more of your earnings are filtering through to your net income. If it was flat, that would imply a marginal tax rate of 100%. And we can actually dive into anything in the model. So for example, I might be interested in how income tax changes with income. And we can see if you earn 9,500, your income tax is 0. That's expected. But we can also see things like this household doesn't have universal credit, but we can see under what conditions they might be eligible to universal credit. So we can actually see this household is basically just outside of the eligibility range. This wouldn't have been obvious if we had just plugged this household into a benefit calculator or just straight into the household net income calculator, because it would just be 0. But using this kind of feature, we can basically see, okay, here's where we stand in relation to the whole landscape of tax and benefits. The other thing that we can do here is calculate marginal tax rates. So for those of you who are not familiar with marginal tax rates, your marginal tax rate is essentially the percentage of a £1 pay rise that does not filter through to your net income. So if you increase your income by £100 and your taxes go up by £50, then that means that your marginal tax rate is 50%. So this is a good kind of approximation for what kind of work incentives people face and how much of every marginal pound they get to keep. And we can see, you've probably seen this chart reported on in the media. It's been subject to frequent attention over the last decade. It's basically showing that due to how the personal allowance or the child benefit high income tax charge or universal credit phases in or out, you end up with very different work incentives at very different parts of the earning spectrum, and it doesn't always align with how we'd expect a 0, 20, 40% marginal rates to affect things. So that is our snapshot of this household under current law. And I'd also just add, any of these charts you can reproduce in Python. So we've got a little snippet generator here that means that if you just copy this code snippet, you can actually pull out these numbers from a Jupyter notebook or anything else that is capable of running Python code. So all of this is open source, and you can just take these numbers and plug it into your own chart code, etc. The interesting thing here, though, is not just always how does current tax benefit policy affect a household, but it's how would a reform to tax or benefit rules change this household's results here. And we can do this by essentially expanding this little compare against the reform section here and using any of the reforms that we have already made or are about to make in the PolicyEngine app. So, for example, I'm going to plug in the autumn budget 2024. Let's go with the employer national insurance reforms. So these reforms increase the rate of employers' national insurance, and we assume as part of this reform that this filters through, at least in part, to workers' wages. So we've just grabbed a reform and plugged it straight into this household and gotten back some results. So we have a clear statement of impact here. The employer national insurance reforms in the autumn budget 2024 decrease your disposable income by about £200. And we can see a breakdown of why using the exact same scaffold that we saw earlier. So market income changes by this much, taxes fall by this much. So we've got some response here. Income tax and national insurance go down because your wages have fallen. So there's a pretty sort of complex story under the hood here, but we can see clearly it's a net impact of negative. And we can also plug this into the varying your earnings section. So we can look at the exact same spectrum of earnings distributions, but with baseline and also this reform for comparison. So we can see exactly, what is the full picture of reforms? Where does this household sit in relation to less or more earnings, and how would those less or more earnings affect how this household turns out? So we'll give this chart a few seconds to catch up and then look at what it says.
Nikhil, a point that I want to mention is that for those they don't know how to actually save the reforms here, there is a kind of button in the reform impact page that you can directly that button directly guides you to this page. So there's no need to actually save. You can just.
That's a great point. I think after this bit, I'll actually just briefly recap that bit of the app. So what we can see here, and this is a very interesting chart, is for every kind of simulated earnings level, how much would the autumn budget have affected you? And broadly, it phases in with income, but there's all sorts of jumps all over the place here. And these jumps make sense because we are basically saying, at this point, we're comparing a household that does not have an earnings does not have their wages cut as a result of this reform, with a household that has had a wage cut because of the national insurance reform. And we've got situations here where those two people are different sides of a tax bracket. One's on a 40p band and one's on a 20p band, so they begin to diverge quite quickly. But you can do this with any kind of reform. For a lot of reforms, it looks a lot simpler than this. And you can look at sort of the relative change and sort of dive down into the details that often, if we're just looking at, the macro level of how a reform costs the government or how much it raises for the government, you often miss a lot of the details and sort of the very strange looking charts that it generates for households. I'm sure anyone who's looked at the marginal tax rate schedule for just baseline current tax law would have told you that it's very unlikely that anyone looked at that and thought, okay, this is exactly the kind of policy design we're aiming for. A lot of the time, it's just a lot more sort of unexpectedly complex on the household side. And I think this tool kind of makes those complexities bare. We can also see how marginal tax rates were affected by this reform, and it's much of the same sort of story. So while that is loading, I'll briefly show you. If we go back to the policy reform impacts from last time, we've got the policy reform calculator here. And for example, if I create a new reform, let's say I'm going to raise the basic rate to 26 percentage points.
Don't forget to press enter after changing it.
Yes, good point. Raising the basic rate to 26%. I'm going to rename that. Once I've done that, I'll be able to say this policy is saved and I can find it by searching it at any point here. I can also jump to my profile because I've signed in, and once I run the simulation impact, I can basically see all of the policies that I've recently computed here, including the named ones, for example. Okay, cool. So with that, I think I will pass back to, let's have a look.
Does it calculate the marginal tax rate? Because...
Yes, let's have a look. So I guess here there's a sort of interestingly kind of like a marginal tax rate difference in and around the kind of like thresholds for the tax brackets. This is probably not a great reform to do marginal tax rate analysis with, given that it doesn't really affect direct taxes. So this is kind of just more of a proxy for how the employer changes wages. But you can do this with other sort of reforms like the basic rate, and you'd expect a sort of much more straightforward kind of 20% kind of straight rise in the marginal tax rate.
What we actually expect that kind of jump in the difference between the marginal tax rate is because when you get closer to the band of each, band incomes, for example, changing a little bit between that threshold for the boundary of the income.
Yeah, I suppose if the employer is reducing wages, and if you are on a lower tax bracket because of the employer reduces wages, if you earn that more, you'll counteract that and
so you
sort of eliminate it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that is the case. A lot of these charts, like when you're looking at individual household level reforms, they can be sort of quite hard to interpret, but they still exist. Like these are still the impacts facing households. Okay, right. I'm going to go back to the slides now and just sort of give a brief overview of the constituency calibration work that we are nearly concluding. So just a note on methodology. The UK government has a wealth of data on local areas. So in local areas, we know, what the earnings percentile distribution looks like. We know how many people of different ages there are. We know how many sort of jobs there are in a given constituency. And we can use all of those data to essentially calibrate our national level data for each of the 650 political constituencies of the UK. It's also another sort of complication in the fact that there was that massive boundary rewrite between 2010 and 2024 constituencies. But there are sort of data science methods to get around this by mapping constituencies together and sort of by closest fit estimation. But the end result of all of this, and what we'll sort of soon be adding to the app, which I think is quite exciting, is the ability to disaggregate impacts by local constituencies. And when you do that, you get something that looks like this pretty fascinating chart, I think. So, for example, for any given constituency in the UK, we have a version of our national level data that has all of the same kind of details and all of the same granularity, but it's calibrated to be consistent with all the statistics that we have about that local area. So, for example, what I've got here is a heat map showing the effect of following the Office for Budget Responsibility's recent economic and fiscal outlook, all of their assumptions around earnings growth, around inflation, house price growth, all of those things, in combination with the constituency level weights that we've been developing. And you can really kind of see, okay, which constituencies are set to gain the most in terms of real disposable income, and which constituencies are set to gain the least. And you can kind of see this looks like a story of London in the southeast, which kind of makes sense given the sort of higher earnings profile of those areas. But the other important thing here is that once we launch this feature, for any given policy reform that you can analyze at the nationwide level, you'll be able to draw down to this local level. It might be interesting to see how many constituencies the autumn budget benefited, or if any, like if the rise in fuel duty sort of tax cut was enough to counteract the other rises in any of the constituencies, or how would a given alternative policy reform affect incomes in those constituencies. So looking ahead, we'll be running our next training session on constituency level impacts. We'll be sort of giving a bit of a deeper dive into microdata enhancements. So ahead of then, we'll be circulating the sort of date and time of that one. But until then, thanks for watching, and we welcome any questions either now or over email. Thanks to those of you that have sent those in beforehand. But yeah. Okay, well, if there are no questions, we can probably call it there. But yeah, thanks for that, everyone, and have a good day.